And I'm going to start with verse 1 here. And it says, "O Lord, remember David and all the hardships he endured. He swore an oath to the Lord and made a vow to the Mighty One of Jacob. I will not enter my house or go to bed. I will allow no sleep in my eyes, no slumber to my eyelids, till I find a place for the Lord, a dwelling place for the Mighty One of Jacob." Now this first part just fascinates me. Really fascinates me. I mean, we know that David was a man after God's own heart, as it says. But yet, if we looked at David's life and some of the things that he did, he wasn't a perfect man by any means of the imagination. In fact, we see in one point in his life where he actually desired the wife of another man, even so much that he went and had that husband killed so that he could be with him, and then tried to sweep everything under the carpet. And look, if we were to put that in our context in today's society, if that was our Prime Minister and what he did, we'd be calling out for his resignation at least, let alone anything else. And yet that's exactly what David did. And yet, fascinatingly enough, the Lord saw that he was to forgive this man and to put everything right. David wasn't without consequence. And he certainly wasn't without his pain within that. So we're not looking at a perfect man by any means. But I find it interesting that it starts off this passage and says, "O Lord, remember David." This is funny because we talk about, say, an all-powerful, all-knowing God. A God that's everywhere at once. A Lord that was there right back at the beginning of time. He knew each and every one of our names before we had even been born. In fact, at the creation, right at the very beginning, or before that if you like, he knew each and every one of us. And yet, the person who writes this psalm says, "O Lord, remember David." Isn't it funny that we might look and say, "Hey Lord, do you remember this? Do you remember your promises? Do you remember what you said?" Isn't that interesting? Why is it that we would say, "God, remember David," or "remember your promises"? If you jump back, this actually is referenced from another passage right back in 2 Samuel chapter 7. And we see in this passage here where David had just been proclaimed king. He had finally, after many, many trials and tribulations, was settled in his own palace. And it says at the beginning, after the king, that is David, was settled in his palace, and the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies around him, he said to Nathan the prophet, "Here I am, living in a place of cedar, while the ark of God remains in a tent." And here we see something about the real depth of David's character, and in that he cares profoundly about the Lord. He cares profoundly about seeing God glorified and finding a place for the presence of the Lord. And we know now that the Lord cannot be contained to a tent or a temple or anything like that. But here we find David saying, "I want to make a temple. I want to make somewhere for you, God. Why have I got a place to live and yet you are still in this tent here?" And the prophet Nathan says to him, "Whatever you have in mind, go ahead and do it, for the Lord is with you." And so David, it seems, goes to prepare plans to build a temple for the Lord. And that night, the Lord responds to him. I'm going to read from verse 8. "Now then, tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture and from following the flock to be the ruler over my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I have cut off all your enemies from before you. Now I will make your name great, like the names of the greatest men on earth. And I will provide a place for my people Israel, and will plant them so that they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore, as they did in the beginning, and have done ever since the time I have appointed leaders over my people Israel. I will give you rest from all your enemies. Isn't it interesting to see how God responds? David seeks to honour the Lord, and yet the Lord, it seems, seeks to honour David. He seeks to make David's name great, all at the same time that David is trying to seek to make the Lord's name great. And we know from history and from the rest of the scriptures, and in fact further on in this passage, that it wasn't God's desire for David to build the temple. It was God's desire for his son Solomon to build the temple. But a little bit further down in the passage, in verse 13, he talks about it. He says, "He is the one who will build a house for my name. I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he goes wrong, I will punish him with the rod of men and inflict with floggings inflicted by men. Your house and your kingdom," in verse 16, "will endure forever before me, and your throne will be established forever." Now, I'm not sure when David was writing this, well, not writing this, but a part of his story, that when David was crying out and saying, "I want to make a place for the Lord, I want your name to be great," I wonder how aware he was of the depths of God's promises, and the strange fact that David, in showing up and doing these things, was actually a part of God's plan all along. And in fact, you'll find that David, and we know this because we're on this side of history and we can look back and look at the scriptures, that David was part of God's plan. Not just for now, but for forevermore. And God confirms to David that he was going to provide a ruler to be on the throne for all time. And we discover that in Jesus. But hang on, earlier on in the Bible, God got a bit upset with his people because they were demanding a king. And God turned around and said, "Hey, this king person is not a good for you because he's going to rule over you. He's going to take what you have and he's going to oppress you and he's going to do all sorts of crazy things." And we see that with his predecessor Saul. And one big difference between King Saul and King David is that Saul, it seems, was a lot more about himself and didn't seem to care so much about the presence of the Lord or building a temple or any of these sorts of things. It seems that he was more interested in seeing his name being great rather than God's. But right back in Genesis, in chapter 17, in verse 16, and this slide is not there. Verse 15. It's a conversation between God and Abraham. "As for Sarah, your wife, you are no longer to call her Sarai. Her name will be Sarah. I will bless her and will surely give you a son by her. I will bless her so that she will be the mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her." So it seems that all along it was God's plan to have a king. It was always God's plan to have a righteous ruler for his people. And we see that happen in Jesus. And so we have the psalmist reminding God, God, remember David. Remember the promise that you have for him. Remember the coming king. So when I read this, I don't look at this and think that God necessarily needs reminding of these things. I think it's really us that needs to be reminded of God's promises from time to time. If you're anything like me, I seem to be quite forgetful of these things. Sometimes I can get quite fearful about situations, about conflicts, about trials, about tribulations, just like David did. Sometimes I forget that God's there and that he cares and that he's got a plan and a purpose and that he's got it all under control. And isn't that the truth? I mean, right at the end of the Bible it says ultimately everything's going to be okay. So why do I worry? And it dawns on me as well that as small as we may be, as insignificant that our role might be on this planet, some of us may be called to big things, some of us called to small things. But it dawns on me that each of us, in big, in small ways, but in ways that I cannot fathom, we're still a part of God's story. We are still on the path of seeing God's promises fulfilled. And I need to be remembering that one day Jesus will come again. He will rescue us. And in fact, he does rescue us. And he does care. And so my challenge tonight, as we see that our story as a bigger part of God's story, as a bigger part of history, just in the way that David's story became a song, a psalm, may our lives too become a psalm. May our story too, and our lives and the things that we live, become a song to you that glorifies you, that lifts you up, that makes you amazing. And I pray, Lord, that as we honour you and we seek to lift you up and as we seek to magnify you, not just on Sundays when we're at church, but in our daily lives, as we learn to trust your promises, I pray, Father, that you would help us to remind you of your promises in our lives, that we may remember you and your promises also. Thank you for everything. Lord, I pray, Lord, that you would remember us in the same way that you remembered David. That you would remember your people, Lord. We live in a land at the moment, in a world that's full of trials. Lord, we have people that have been sick. We have people that have died. We have lost loved ones. Many of us have lost jobs. We don't know where the future sits and where it's going. Lord, we know somewhat of the fulfillment of future, but Lord, where we are, we do not know. Lord, we know that you are changing things. And in the same way, Lord, that David showed up and he made a plan to make a place for you, Lord, you turned around and you said, no, you've got other plans. I pray, Lord, that in the same way that you did for David, that you would use our current situation in our current world. And I pray, Lord, that you would share with us your plans, that you would set us straight with your promise.